You know that old saying, history is written by the victors?
Mm-hmm.
It's such a cliche, right? We kind of tune it out. We think of wars, revolutions, that sort of thing. But I want you to apply it to something else. Something where the stakes are, well, arguably even higher.
Religion.
Religion. Specifically, the very, very first chapters of Christian history.
And it's an era that most people feel like they know, even if they haven't, studied it deeply.
Exactly.
We've got the apostles, they established the church, and it's all a straight line from there.
We have this mental map, don't we? It's the Sunday school version. Jesus teaches the apostles. The apostles have the truth with a capital T, and they go plant this pure church.
And then later the bad guys show up.
The heretics, yeah. They try to corrupt the original message. It's a very clean story. Good guys first, bad guys later. But what if that map is completely upside down? What if I told you that in some of the most important centers of the ancient world, the heretics were actually there first? That for a huge number of early believers, what we call heresy today was simply Christianity.
And that is the unsettling question at the heart of our deep dives today. We are looking at a landscape that wasn't a unified front at all, but, well, something much more like a theological Wild West.
And to navigate this Wild West, we are unpacking a real heavy hitter, a book called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity by Walter Bauer. Now, this was originally published in 1934.
Right, which might sound a little dusty.
It might, but don't let the date fool you.
Yeah.
This book was like a grenade tossed into the playground of biblical scholarship. A huge name in the field, Helmut Koester, called it the foundation for all modern scholarship on the topic.
Bauer's work is just indispensable. It is. He challenged a narrative that had stood, basically unchallenged for almost 2,000 years. He forced historians to stop just reading the documents the victors preserved and start looking at the gaps, the silence.
Right.
He applied a legal principle. Audiatur et altera pars.
Let the other side be heard. I love that. It sounds like something out of a courtroom drama.
It is, in a way. And when you let the other side speak, or at least you try to hear their echoes in history, the whole story changes completely.
So that's our mission today. We're going to examine Bauer's controversial thesis that in places like Edessa and Egypt, heresy didn't break away from the church.
It was the church.
It was the church, until Rome and other big centers stepped in to, quote-unquote, fix it.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's set the baseline. Before Bauer, what was the standard story? I mentioned the pure church idea, but who actually wrote that script?
Well, that script was written by the early church fathers, men like Eusebius, Hegesippus, Tertullian. They were the victors we talked about.
Okay.
And their view was that the church began as a pure virgin. That's the actual phrase Hegesippus uses.
Oh, a pure virgin. That's a very loaded image.
It is. It implies this unadulterated truth. So in this view, truth is primary. It comes first, chronologically. Error, or heresy, is secondary. It comes later.
Right.
The church father Origen put it really bluntly. He said, all heretics at first are believers, then later they swerve from the rule of faith. The assumption is that heresy is always a corruption.
So you can't have a heresy unless you have the truth first to deviate from.
Exactly.
It's a very comforting narrative. It means the real thing was always there, clear as day from the beginning. But Bauer looks at the map and says, not so fast.
Bauer flips this completely. He argues that in a lot of regions, the forms of Christianity that were later branded heretical, like Marcionism or Gnosticism, they were actually the original and primary forms of the faith in those places.
Okay, hold on. Let me get this straight. So if I'm a Christian living in, say, one of these cities in the year 120, the thing I believe in, which my grandkids will be told is evil heresy, is just the only version of Christianity I've ever known.
Precisely. In those places, what we call orthodoxy, the theology that eventually won, was the latecomer. And often it was a tiny, struggling minority.
Wow.
Bauer reminds us that majority and minority are fluid. What you think is truth in 2nd century Edessa would be a dangerous lie to a Christian in 4th century Rome.
That is a massive claim. You can't just say that, you have to prove it. And Bauer does this by taking us on a tour, region by region.
He does.
I want to start with his first case study because it really does read like a detective novel. Let's talk about Edessa.
Edessa. It's in eastern Syria, modern-day Urfa in Turkey. And it's a crucial case study because it was right on the edge of the Roman Empire. It was a buffer state, so it was outside Rome's immediate control for a long time.
And Edessa has this fantastic origin story, right? The official history, the Abgar legend.
It's a wonderful story. Eusebius tells us there was a king in Edessa, Abgar V. a contemporary of Jesus.
So King Abgar gets sick. He's heard about this healer in Palestine, Jesus. And I love this part. He writes Jesus a letter. He asks him to come to Edessa, heal him, and even offers him a safe place to live.
And the kicker is, Jesus writes back.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Jesus says he can't come, but he promises to send a disciple later. After the ascension, the apostle Thaddeus, or Ed-I, shows up, heals the king, and boom.
The whole city converts.
The whole city converts. And Eusebius claims he went to the archives in Edessa and actually held the letters in his own hands.
Signed by Jesus.
It's so compelling, right? A direct link to Jesus, a royal conversion. It establishes Edessa as an apostolic foundation. But Bauer, well, he just dismantles this completely.
He says it's a fake.
A later forgery, probably from the 4th century. Bauer even points the finger at a bishop named Kuhn.
Why would a bishop fake a letter from Jesus? That seems, I don't know, unchristian.
Well, it's about authority. Bauer looks at the actual historical evidence, specifically a local document called the Chronicle of Edessa. And this chronicle says the first church building was constructed in 313 CE under that same Bishop Kuhn, which is surprisingly late.
313 CE, that's almost 300 years after Jesus. Surely there were Christians there before then. You can't have a 300-year gap.
Oh, there were Christians. But this is where Bauer plays detective. He looks at who the chronicle mentions before that church building.
And it's not Orthodox bishops.
It's not. It lists 3 key figures, Marcion, Bardesanes, and Mani.
Wait, those names? I know those names.
Yeah.
Those are the A-listers of heresy. Marcion rejected the Old Testament God. Bardesanes was a Gnostic astrologer. Mani founded a whole other religion.
Exactly. The local records remember the heretics as the defining figures. The Orthodox Church doesn't even show up in the record until much, much later.
So the bad guys were the founding fathers of Christianity in Edessa.
It appears so.
Yeah.
And Bauer points out this little linguistic detail that I find fascinating. It's about what these groups call themselves.
Okay.
In Edessa, the group we would call Orthodox, the ones aligned with Rome, they weren't originally called Christians.
What were they called?
They were called Polutians.
Polutians,
Man.
like followers of a guy named Pollute.
Correct. Pollute was their leader.
That's really telling. Usually the splinter group gets the weird nickname. If you're a Lutheran, you follow Luther separate from the main Catholic body. So if the Orthodox were called Polutians, does that mean the heretics were just called
Christians.
Wow.
It implies the Marcionites were the establishment. They owned the brand. The Orthodox were the weird little sect. And Bauer notes that even in the 4th century, an Orthodox writer named Ephraim complains bitterly about this. He says, "Cursed be those who let themselves be called by the name of Pollute instead of the name of Christ."
He's mad because he's losing the branding war.
He's shouting at the wind. And it went deeper than just names. It was their Bible, too.
Okay.
The Christians in Edessa didn't use the 4 Gospels we use, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They used something called the Diatessaron.
The Diatessaron. Break that down for us.
It's a gospel harmony created by a man named Tatian. He took the 4 Gospels and wove them into one single story, but he edited them. He cut out things like the genealogies of Jesus.
Which makes sense if you're a Gnostic or a Marcionite. You don't want Jesus to have a human lineage. You want him to just appear.
Exactly. It fit their theology. And here's the kicker. Bauer shows that even the Orthodox Polutians used this tainted book. Because they didn't have their own translation of the 4 separate Gospels yet. The heretical text was the standard text in town.
That just paints such a clear picture. The heretics are the majority, they own the name Christian, and their Bible is the only one available. Bishop Kuhn faking those letters makes total sense now. He's the underdog. He needs a trump card.
He needs to say, hey, forget Pollute. We've got a letter from Jesus himself. That's Bauer's conclusion. Orthodoxy in Edessa was a later import that had to fight and fabricate to get a foothold.
Okay, let's move west to the intellectual capital of the ancient world, Alexandria in Egypt. You'd think, with its famous library, we would have mountains of records about the early church there.
And yet, we face what Bauer calls a weird gap. We know almost nothing, really, about Egyptian Christianity until around the year 180.
That's a huge gap. That's like missing American history from the Pilgrims to the Civil War.
It is. Eusebius, who loves listing bishops, has practically nothing to say about Egypt for a century and a half. And Bauer's take is that this silence is intentional.
What do you mean?
He argues that Eusebius found nothing good, meaning nothing orthodox to report. So he just reported nothing.
The thumper rule of history. If you can't say something nice, orthodox, don't say anything at all.
Pretty much.
So what was happening in that silence? It wasn't empty.
Far from it. Gnosticism was flourishing. The greatest Gnostic leaders, Basilides, Valentinus, Carpocrates, they were all Egyptians. And the scraps of literature that survive from that early period, they aren't the New Testament. They're things like the Gospel of the Egyptians.
Which is a very different flavor of Christianity.
Oh, very different. Esoteric dialogues with the Salome, rejecting the body, rejecting gender. And for Jewish Christians, you have the Gospel of Hebrews.
I remember a quote from that one. Jesus says something that would make a modern theologian faint. My mother, the Holy Spirit, seized me by one of my hairs.
And carried me to the great mountain Tabor.
Okay.
Yes, a theology where the Holy Spirit is female, a divine mother. Bauer's point is that in early Egypt, you didn't have the church versus heresy. You just had a mix, a syncretism.
A blending of beliefs.
Yes, the boundaries weren't drawn. Even Clement of Alexandria, an early church father who was considered orthodox, he quotes the Gospel of the Egyptians. He doesn't burn it or call it fake. He treats it as another source. He prefers the four Gospels, sure, but he doesn't see it as something to be destroyed.
It sounds so much more fluid, so when does the hammer come down? When does orthodoxy finally show up and say, okay, party's over?
Bauer points to one man, Bishop Demetrius, around 109 CE. He is the first monarchical bishop in Alexandria.
Monarchical. Ruling like a monarch. One boss.
Before him, leadership seems to have been looser. A council of elders, maybe? Demetrius changes that. He organizes the true church and basically launches a campaign to bring this chaotic Egyptian scene in line with Rome.
This is the crackdown.
This is the crackdown. He eventually persecutes Origen, the greatest theologian in the city, just because Origen was too independent. Demetrius is the corporate fixer from HQ, trying to take control of a landscape that had been predominantly Gnostic for a century.
And the silence in the earlier record is just the historians covering up the fact that for a long time, the Gnostics were the Egyptian church.
That's the argument, a rewriting of history in real time.
Okay, we have to talk about Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. This is usually seen as the stronghold of Paul and John. Surely here, orthodoxy was safe.
You would think so. This is where New Testament letters were sent. But Bauer points us to the letters of a man named Ignatius of Antioch to show that things were actually quite desperate.
Ignatius is a big deal. A bishop, martyred around 110 CE. On his way to Rome, he writes these really intense letters.
He does. And if you read them, Ignatius is absolutely obsessed with one thing.
Obedience to the bishop.
It's on every page.
Yeah.
Obey the bishop. Do nothing without the bishop. He sounds like he's panicking.
He really does.
And Bauer asks the obvious question. Why is he screaming? You don't demand submission if everyone is already submitted.
Yeah.
You don't shout, stay in line, at a neat row of soldiers. Bauer calls him a general without an army.
That's a great image. A general shouting orders, but when he looks back, nobody's following.
He acts like a dictator because he's fighting a losing battle. He complains about wild beasts in Ephesus and Philadelphia. He talks about people holding meetings without his permission.
So these aren't just a few grumblers. He's describing a situation where the heretics are operating openly and probably outnumbering him.
And Bauer backs this up with a brilliant observation about the geography. He says, compare Ignatius's letters to the book of Revelation.
Okay. Revelation, written by John to the 7 churches of Asia.
Right. Ignatius writes to churches in the same region just a few decades later. But, and this is the key, he skips some of the most important cities from Revelation. He doesn't write to Pergamum or Thyatira or Sardis.
Why ignore them? Those are major hubs.
Bauer's theory is that he ignored them because they were total losses. He had no Orthodox bridgehead there. There was nobody on his side to even write a letter to.
They were so heretical that the Orthodox bishop couldn't even get a word in edgewise.
That's the implication.
Huh.
And remember, even in Revelation, decades earlier, John's complaining about the Nicolaitans and this woman he calls Jezebel, who's leading the church astray in Thyatira.
Which proves that heresy wasn't outside the gates trying to get in.
It was already inside. It was running the show. The Orthodox were the outsiders looking in.
We see this with Polycarp too, right? Another famous martyr. He called Marcion the firstborn of Satan.
Strong words.
Mm-hmm.
But Bauer shows that words were all he had. Polycarp couldn't actually stop Marcion. Marcionism flourished right under his nose in Smyrna. And there's this chilling detail from decades later. A man named Pionius, an Orthodox martyr, is dying for his faith, but he is martyred right alongside a Marcionite presbyter.
The heretic and the Orthodox dying in the same fire?
It shows the Marcionites were still major players long after Polycarp. They had their own clergy. They were committed enough to die for their faith. To the Romans, they were all just Christians.
So let's look at the scoreboard. Edessa is dominated by Marcionites, Egypt by Gnostics. Asia Minor is a struggle where the Orthodox bishops are losing control. The picture Bauer paints is that Orthodoxy was the underdog in the 2nd century.
It was the minority view in a lot of key places.
So the million-dollar question, how did they win? If they were the minority, how did they end up writing the history books?
Bauer points to one major factor: Rome.
The empire.
The church in Rome. Rome was the capital of the world. It had the resources, the money, the organization. The Roman church started to exert its influence outwards.
Like a franchise headquarters taking over independent mom-and-pop shops.
That is a cynical, but
yeah,
very accurate analogy. Rome supported Demetrius in Egypt. Rome sent aid to struggling Orthodox minorities in other cities. Rome pushed the Peter and Paul apostolic brand.
They had the infrastructure.
And eventually, under Constantine, they aligned with the political power of the empire. Once the ecclesiastical party, as Bauer calls it, had the state's backing, they could label everything else as heresy and suppress it.
They won the war, so they got to write the history.
They got to write the history and say, we were always the majority, we were always the pure stream. And Bauer's work is just scraping away that top layer of paint to show the cracks underneath.
This really changes how we have to view the New Testament, early history, everything. It wasn't a pure stream that got polluted. It was a struggle between different versions of Christianity from the very beginning.
It forces you to realize that the heretics weren't villains trying to destroy the faith. In their own minds, they were the faithful.
Right.
The Marcionites in Edessa didn't think they were heretics. They thought they were the true Christians, and they were being displaced by this new version that came in later.
It makes you question the labels true and false. It's all about perspective.
And power.
I want to leave you with a final thought on this. Bauer suggests that what we call heresy might have been the only form of Christianity a person in 2nd century Edessa or Egypt ever knew. So imagine you're living there, you go to your church, you read your scriptures, the gospel of the Egyptians maybe, and you believe with all your heart you are a faithful Christian. And then someone from Rome shows up and tells you you've been wrong your whole life.
If the heretics were there first, and the Orthodox came later to fix them, who actually deviated from whom?
That is the question. Thanks for diving deep with us today into the messy, fascinating origins of faith. Keep asking questions, and we'll see you next time.